Okay. Thank you for everybody who has been patiently waiting in the waiting room. We've had some technical difficulties we're trying to work out. We think we've got them done. So we're happy to see you today. Welcome to the first CHoW meeting of 2025. Hope everybody had a wonderful holiday season celebrating with those near and dear to you. Today we have Kim Prothro Williams, who is going to be talking to us about lost farm and estates in Washington, D.C., kind of a step back into D.C.'s rural history and see how we changed from rural to such a bustling city as we are now. And Judy Mazza will do a better, more formal introduction. Please hold your questions to the end of the presentation. Fine to put them in chat as they come to you, but we'll take the questions after the presentation is over. Okay, Judy.
Okay, thank you, Pam. We're privileged to have Kim Prothro Williams speaking to us today. She is an architectural historian who has been researching and writing about historic places and communities in and around DC for the past 30 years. She's a National Register Coordinator of DC's Historic Preservation Office, where she studied a diverse range of buildings and communities and has developed a particular interest in the history of planning and the evolution of place. She wrote a book, Lost Farms and Estates of Washington, D.C., that we're going to be learning about. I mean, I know that I'm a transplant to DC. I've only been here since 1971. So I'm really curious to hear a little more about the architectural history of Washington and the transition that was made and to become the city that we all know and love now. So with that, let me turn this over to Kim.
Thank you, Judith, and hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out to hear a little bit about rural Washington. When I was first asked to give this presentation, I was a little bit reluctant because, as Judith said, I'm an architectural historian and not a food historian. And I know your all's interest is in the culinary history of Washington, but there's certainly a close connection between rural Washington and the farms of Washington and what we put on our plates. So I agreed to do this. So I hope you will excuse all of the photos of buildings and maps, and we can talk a little bit about this book. But my goal in writing the book was really to show the transformation of the rural landscape from the establishment of the city in 1790 until suburbanization in the late 19th and early 20th century. The title of the book, Lost Farms and Estates of Washington, D.C., is a little bit of a misnomer. It was kind of dubbed by the publisher, who said that if you put lost in the title, it sells more books. But it really has more to do with telling the story of rural Washington through many of those buildings that have survived. So many of those rural and agricultural buildings that we still have on our landscape today. Caroline, if you could advance the next slide, please. I thought I would just start a little bit by telling you how I came to write this book. It is part of a study that I undertook in my role as National Register Coordinator for the DC Historic Preservation Office. And one of our missions in the office is to identify buildings for designation, historic buildings. And I review those landmark applications, and then we designate them as DC landmarks and list them in the National Register if they merit listing and meet the criteria. So one time, probably now 7 or 8 years ago, we got a nomination for this building in the upper right that you can see in the slide for a great Mediterranean revival style villa that had been built as a school for young women, sort of a finishing school, a seminary that's up at 16th and Kalmia streets today. But what was intriguing about this landmark application to me was not only that this had been built by a woman educator for women, but also there was this spring house sitting in the front of the villa down in a sort of a swale. And I became very curious about that spring house and started to do a little bit more research and discovered that villa had been built in the 1920s on an old early 19th century farmstead. And you can see that farmstead in this map that says Old Fenwick Farmstead. And if you see to the right, there's an ice pond and a little black square. That is the ice house to the right of that little pond. And so I started to do some research, found out that the Fenwick homestead was headed by Philip Fenwick, who had been born on the property before the establishment of the District of Columbia. He had farmed his land for many years with the help of 6 enslaved persons. And in the 1850 agricultural census records, I saw that he grew potatoes, wheat, oats, rye, and corn. But also what really struck me is that he produced 312 pounds of butter. And I realized that all of that butter, which he sold at local market, had been stored in this little spring house that still stood on the property. And so I just got very intrigued. Next slide, please. And when I started researching that property a little bit more, I discovered that after his death, his daughter, Mary, who was married to a guy named John Van Ryswick, who was a businessman in DC, had inherited a portion of the property, and they had built their own house on that section of the property. You can see the circle, the blue circle at the left of the map on the top of the screen was where that spring house is today, where the old Fenwick farmstead stood. And to the right, further east, is this house that the Van Ryswicks built, which was their country estate on the former farm. I started researching that house, and there were a lot of local neighborhood histories. It's in Shepherd Park today. It's near 13th and Jonquil Streets. And the Shepherd Park histories had misidentified that house. They'd identified it as belonging to different people through time, and no one had identified it as being the Van Ryswick house. And so when I made this connection, a couple of things struck me, and I thought, how is it that, if these two resources existed with little understanding, what might else be out there that we know nothing about, their associations with one another or their associations with the rural community. So I started and just decided I needed to do a citywide survey to see what resources I could discover and what their associations were with other buildings. So next slide, please. So I set about doing this in a very old school method. I took historic maps that pre-existed the suburban street plan of the larger District of Columbia. And you can see that's the 1894 Hopkins map above. And then I compared those maps to later maps from 1927 after the streets had been laid out and lots laid out for the construction, for the development of new houses on the lots for suburban Washington. And so it was a pretty laborious process, but you can see here, this is how I did it, and managed to identify surviving buildings associated with rural Washington. So I then would look at the historic maps from 1927. Then I would look at aerial views today. And if I could see that those buildings still stood, then I went out on site to make sure that they were indeed older 19th century buildings. So in the first map at the top, you can see this was the George Barker Farm Complex, and you see 2 of those 3 structures are the same ones that are on that street at 34th and M Street on the map just below it. You can see how those footprints match those 2 buildings. And those buildings also sit on larger lots, and they're skewed to their new laid streets. And so that's kind of a dead giveaway when you see that, when buildings are not aligned to the streets that came after them. It's kind of an indication that they preceded the streets. So next slide, please. So this process worked pretty well, though there were many challenges. And one of the biggest challenges was, turns out that there are many old farmhouses that were moved during their existence. And this is an example of one that's called the Samuel and Harriet Burroughs House. And it was originally constructed in 1850 up near River Road and Ellicott Streets. And it was part of a large farm complex that had a herd of dairy, during the Civil War, they actually provided a lot of food for the soldiers who were camped right nearby. But in 1923, at the death of the last surviving, actually the matriarch of the Burroughs family, the property was subdivided for residential development as AU Park, and the house was moved, and it was moved a mile south to Verplanck Street, where it sits today. And you can't see it in the lower photograph, but it's just to the left of this sort of collection of early to mid 20th century colonial revival style houses, and sits right in line with them. So it would not otherwise have been identified, but we had done some research, and we also found a move permit, and that's sort of shown on this overlaid map on the left. And the move permit gave the exact directions in how the house was moved. And it said, it went down down from River Road to Davenport Street, and then south all the way down to Verplanck Street. And then we found an article about it that said that the house actually sat on its side for a couple of days until it could be righted into into its proper onto its proper foundation. So there were these struggles. There were other struggles, like some of the buildings just really visibly do not look like old buildings. So it was, it had its challenges, but we were pretty effective. And next slide, please. And the study resulted in the identification of about 84 rural properties throughout the District of Columbia, from upper northwest to lower southeast. And this map just shows, a scattering of where those houses, but not necessarily all farmhouses, some of them were associated buildings, stood. So next slide, please. So what I sort of got interested in once I identified these properties was to sort of understand how they fit into the history of rural Washington. And so I just developed this sort of history of rural Washington from the establishment of the city until suburbanization. But what came from that study was there were really three important points and seminal moments of change. And one of these had to do with the establishment of the city itself on this very rural 18th century landscape. The other had to do with the Civil War, and then the third had to do with the development of the street plan outside the city of Washington. So I thought I would sort of address each of those three seminal points of time, and give you some examples of what the cultural landscape looked like at that point. So next slide, please. And before I get started on that, just wanted to give you all a little bit of an overview of the District of Columbia. So when it was established in 1790, it was a 10-mile square area that included part of Virginia and Maryland, and it included the port at Georgetown, which was a very important 18th century tobacco port. After its establishment, the federal government established the city of Washington, which was on this larger 100 square mile area, sat in the center of it. And you can see where that Pierre L'Enfant's street plan is laid out in that larger area, which is today generally defined by Florida Avenue on the north. Florida Avenue was a natural edge of the city. There was a very steep escarpment beyond Florida Avenue. And then it spanned the area between basically Rock Creek, the Potomac River, and the eastern branch of the Potomac River, which is today's Anacostia River. So you can see that part of the city of Washington that was established in 1790. The rest of the area south of the Potomac River was part of Alexandria County. It was part of the District of Columbia, but was retroceded to Virginia in 1847. So I'm not really going to talk about it today. But what the rest of the area was called was Washington County. And Washington County included Georgetown, which was its own independent port town. It included Tinleytown, which was a small crossroads community at the intersection of two rural roads, River Road and today's Wisconsin Avenue. And it was a very convenient stopping place for farmers, tobacco merchants who were going down to the port at Georgetown to ship their product. And it was a stopping point. There was a tavern there. It was called John. It was run by John Tennelly. So it was John Tennelly's Tavern, and a blacksmith shop was built there. There was the tavern and a couple other retail establishments set up there, and it eventually became a pretty thriving small village. But that's just sort of to give you the lay of the land. The rest of Washington County, other than Georgetown and Tenleytown, was rural landscapes. And some of it was cultivated, a lot of it was wooded, and much of it was just sort of marshy fields. And so next slide, please. So basically in the 17th century, all of that land had been part of a land patent system whereby merchants, people of high social standing, businessmen were given, the Englishmen, I should say, were given land patents in the colony of Maryland and Virginia. And they extended into what we call the Upper Potomac region. In the 17th century, most of the owners of this land did not live on the land. They lived in the Tidewater region. They had huge, extensive plantations in the Tidewater region, but they had these farms that were tenanted. They had tenants on the property, or they had overseers overseeing enslaved labor, cultivating the crops. By the 18th century, the descendants of these original patentees actually came to live on the land because the Tidewater land had been already divided up to other children and other descendants. And so they kept spreading further and further out. So the first owners, the first occupants, I should say, of the land were descendants of these original patentees. And so on the high end of that scale, of that farming scale, you have these extensive tobacco plantations, such as this one, which was that owned by Notley Young. It included 700 acres of land and a very extensive domestic complex that extended for 200 yards along the Potomac River. That house that you see in red in the middle of the screen, which was Notley Young's plantation house, is on the site of Banneker Overlook today. If you know the wharf down in Southwest DC and you ever go there, if you look to your left, there's a hill, and at the top of the hill is a fountain. It's called Banneker Overlook. That is exactly where this plantation stood. And the hillside going down to the water had gardens, and it had enslaved quarters, which you can see on the right side of the screen. All of those black, the squares that represent building footprints, those are all enslaved quarters. It included cemetery and gardens. And it also included a wharf where all of the tobacco would be loaded onto vessels that then carried the crop to the port at Georgetown. And let's see, next slide. I think I have another slide showing, so we don't have any other known image of what Notley Young's plantation looked like. All we have is this one map, which is the Prigg map. It was or Prigg's map. It was surveyed by a guy named John Frederick Augustus Priggs in 1790, and the property owners had hired the surveyor to make this map as sort of PR and promotional purposes to sell their land to the federal government. Because as you know, the federal government was looking for a site to build the federal city. And these people saw the benefit of it being here. And so they made this map to present to the federal government to kind of promote their land. And so there you can see, I've circled it in the map at left, there is an image of Notley Young Plantation. And so you can see pretty established, pretty substantial house, 9 bays wide with a big gable roof with end chimneys, much like what you would see in the Georgian mansions on the Tidewater region. But that's the only image we have of Notley Young's house. There is another property, next slide, please, which was another really large plantation house in the area that would become the District of Columbia, but on the east side of the Anacostia River. And this was called Giesboro. It is today located on the site of Joint Base Anacostia Bolling Air Force Base. The house no longer stands, but that was its site anyway. And this property, even though the house seems, a little bit more modest in scale, it was not atypical for farms and plantations this far in the upper Potomac region. And this actually became and was the largest pre-Civil War farm plantation in the DC area and had the greatest number of enslaved workers working on the property until the Civil War. And as I mentioned, the property owners along the Potomac River would transport their tobacco to the port at Georgetown. Those on the Anacostia River, like the owners of Geesboro, they probably would have transported their tobacco crop up to Bladensburg. Bladensburg was also an important 18th century port town, and it would have been just as easy for them to go up the Anacostia to Bladensburg or perhaps around to the Potomac and to Georgetown. But they did it the same way. They had wharves out on the river, and they would take their product, their tobacco, for the most part, down to the wharf and then transport it by vessel. Next slide, please. So for those properties that were beyond the edge of the river, of which there were many further up the Potomac River, especially in today's northwest area, this is one of the larger one of those plantations. This was called Friendship, and this is an image of Friendship before it was demolished. It stood on the site of American University, where it is today, right at Ward Circle. And so these plantations, which also generally were growing tobacco into the 18th century, early 19th century even, didn't have access to the wharves. They would carry their tobacco in what's called hogsheads, and you can see that on the lower right image, those round barrels, and they would be rolled, those hogsheads of tobacco would be rolled by, obviously oxen and horse down to the tobacco ports. And these were thus called rolling roads because they were where tobacco was rolled. And so today's Wisconsin Avenue and River Road were both called rolling roads. Next slide, please. Oops, that's weird. That's sort of weird. Anyway, this is a PDF version, and the photograph in the back should have been in the front. But anyway, I can describe it to you. The images that I've shown up to this point are of the sort of more established, larger plantations that grew tobacco. But interspersed between these large plantations were smaller houses of either tenant farmers who were leasing part of the land from those larger property owners, or they were yeoman farmers, those who actually had bought small acreage from the larger plantation owners, and they farmed their own land. For the most part, these yeomen and tenant farmers did not have enslaved labor. They might have had one or two enslaved persons, but mostly they were self-sufficient farms that they farmed themselves, and they would have farmed grains for their own consumption, or maybe to take to a mill, to wheat to turn into flour. And then they would have had a cow for their own home use, and chickens and pigs, and then also would have had vegetables to grow for self-consumption. And the image that's sort of hidden right now is a typical example of one of these tenant farmhouses. They were typically built into the mid-19th century as wood frame or log structures, and they were all perishable, so none of them stands today. There was the one that's kind of hidden in this photograph that stood until the early 20th century and was captured in a photograph, but otherwise there are none standing. The sole surviving sort of yeoman farmhouse that survives is in Cleveland Park, and it is at the back of a later farmhouse that was built in 1790. This original stone structure, it wasn't wood or log, and that's how it survived, is at the rear of that building, And it was built in 1730. So this is considered actually the oldest surviving building in the District of Columbia. It's the rear wing to Rosedale. Next slide, please. So the establishment of the federal city would forever change the rural landscape within the limits of the new District of Columbia. So there were 30 tracts of land that were owned by about 19 different persons. They were known as the proprietors, and they made up the proprietors 19. The 19 different proprietors had the land that made up that area that is what we call the L'Enfant Plan today, the original city of Washington. And George Washington had come up with a plan because the federal government really didn't have much money to spend. He came up with a plan that involved a creative arrangement of transfer of land from the rural property owners to the federal government. And he felt that it would give these owners a stake in the federal city and its future promise for development. So the agreement that came up was that the proprietors would deed all of their land to the government, no matter how many acres they owned, they would deed it all to the government. And in exchange, once the plan for the federal city was completed, these farmers hadn't yet even seen the plan for the city, but once the city plan was completed, they would then receive financial compensation for that part of the land that was taken for public buildings like the Capitol, the White House, and for reservations. So you think of reservations are like our circles and squares. Those are public reservations. They would be compensated for the land taken for those spaces. They would not be compensated for any of the land that was taken to be platted into streets and avenues. Then, once the plan was laid out with lots, the proprietors would have returned to them half of the lots. The federal government would receive the other half of the lots. And then the proprietors would be allowed to sell their lots on the open market when the city was ready for, to be open for sale. So it was called the 50-50 deal. But in reality, the federal government actually got about 84% of the land, and the landholders, just kept those remaining lots. Next slide, please. So one of the proprietors, his name was David Burns, and he had been cultivating his land for about 25 years. His land, which you can see in the map on the left, extended all the way from, the west side of the White House along Pennsylvania Avenue, all the way practically to the Capitol. So like a really critical part of the L'Enfant Plan and our monumental city today. And David Burns really had no interest in the development of the city. Many of the proprietors saw an opportunity with the city and wanted to be part of the sale. The lands were, really not that fertile any longer, and so they saw an opportunity. David Burns didn't really want anything to do with it. He just wanted to continue to farm his land. So he really put up a fight with the commissioners who were responsible for negotiating this deal. And he finally said he would agree to the plan if the plan would allow him and all the other proprietors to continue farming their land until all of the streets were laid and paved and the lots were ready for sale. And so the commissioners were fed up, but George Washington really saw, that the value of the land, especially David Burns' land, which was in the center of the L'Enfant City, saw that the value was greater than the money. So he offered David Burns more money, and he allowed that clause to remain in the agreement. So David Burns continued to farm his land into the 1800s. And there are lots of letters and meetings in the commissioners' records about the frustration they had with David Burns because he was planting corn along the route of Pennsylvania Avenue, and he was putting up corn instead of oats, which they felt corn was grubbier looking, and it was harder to bring potential buyers into the city to see the lots and to sell them. So they kept encouraging him to plant oats instead of corn. But anyway, he persisted and continued to plant his crops until his death. Next slide, please. So the establishment of the federal city also brought with it an influx of wealthy and educated residents. They're politicians and businessmen, and some of these were gentlemen farmers. And gentlemen farmers are really what I consider people who sought their livelihood um, through jobs in the city, but who had an interest in agriculture, and they were experimenting with new agricultural techniques, animal husbandry, and plant varieties. And John Mason was one of these gentleman farmers, and he built a small plantation on what is today Teddy Roosevelt Island. It was then called Analostan Island. Mason was the son of George Mason. He was a successful planter and statesman. He was the author of the Virginia Bill of Rights. John Mason grew up on his father's family farm in Virginia called Gunston Hall, but as an adult, he moved to Georgetown after the establishment of the city and in 1792, and he purchased a house on M Street. But he also inherited Analostan Island, today's Teddy Roosevelt Island, from his father, who had inherited it from his grandfather. And at that point, the island had served really as kind of a link between Virginia and Maryland. And there had been a ferry going from the Virginia side to the island and then from the island to Georgetown. And John Mason put this causeway in. He built a dam and built this causeway from Virginia to the island. And that then provided access to the ferry that went to Georgetown and created this really important link between Virginia and Georgetown. But he also was very interested in experimenting with agriculture, and he built a plantation on the island. Next slide, please. So this is a map of Roosevelt Island today that shows vestiges of John Mason's plantation there, and then a map from 1818 showing his plantation with a photograph on the right, just across from the footprint of the house. You can see what John Mason's house on Analostan Island looked like. You can see the causeway at the upper left went from the Virginia shore to the island, and then the ferry went across the Potomac to Georgetown. At the end of the causeway is this long lane. You can see there's an alley of trees on either side of the lane that went down to his mansion house. And to either side of the house were these cultivated fields where he experimented with different crops. South of the house, he had an ornamental garden. You can see sort of the round ornamental area, and then vegetable gardens and kitchen gardens. And below that, there were actually enslaved quarters at the southern tip of the island. And he also, John Mason was a member of the Columbia Agricultural Society. It was the first of one of these sort of agricultural kind of self-help groups in the United States. And he became really immersed in experimentation on the island. And here he cultivated a variety of plants. He paid particular attention to purple maize, being corn, which he used for dyeing wool. And he really focused on raising a yellow cotton. But his greatest enthusiasm was his attempt at improving the primitive American woolen industry. Apparently, the British were putting a tax on wool, and so a lot of these gentleman farmers started experimenting with raising merino sheep, which is what John Mason did at Analostan Island. Interestingly, this Columbia Agricultural Society had these annual fairs, and they gave out awards for people with the best maize and the best wool and everything. And so, not surprisingly, he did win some awards, but it's really fascinating to see, exactly what was being grown at the time in the District of Columbia. Next slide, please. And this is Whitehaven, the name of this property. This is a surviving 18th century property that was purchased in the late 18th century by a guy named Thomas Maine. And Thomas Maine was a Scotsman, and he has been described as a lover of nature and one of our foremost early American naturalists. He experimented with the cultivation of a variety of plants and shrubs, but his specialty was the American hawthorn, which he promoted for planting in hedges to divide fields and to enclose estate grounds. He had a book that he published called Directions for the Transplantation and Management of Young Thorn. And Maine, in this publication, Maine extols the environmental and economic benefits of live fencing. So live fencing meaning hedges of thorn plants over post and rail fencing. He was emphasizing that wood fencing contributed to the scarcity of wood, which in turn increased the cost of fuel, and it increased the cost of land. And he further noted that live fencing provided natural habitat for birds and other wildlife. So this property, which sits on Reservoir Road above Canal Road, had was both his nursery, it was his farm where he grew these hedge plants, these thorn plants, but it was also a nursery where he then sold them. And he advertised heavily in local newspapers in the early 19th century. So he was a farmer, but he was also a big businessman, really trying to promote these new plant varieties that he developed. And one order he sold to Thomas Jefferson included 10,000 transplanted plants of the American hedgethorn. And we don't know if it was intended for either the White House or Monticello. What we do know is there is a note on the invoice that survives that read directions to accompany the plants for the president. And the directions were his directions as to how to plant the hedgethorn, how to care for it, and how to maintain it over the years. Next slide, please. And another gentleman farmer was this guy named John Adlam. He is known today even as the father of American viticulture. He was a surveyor. He surveyed in Pennsylvania, and during his surveying of various lands, he developed a keen understanding of native plants. In the early 1800s, he moved to the area that would become the district in what is present-day Cleveland Park, and he established what he called the vineyard, where he became fully immersed in the experimentation of growing grapes for the purposes of developing wine. Now, he initially tried to grow vines imported from European varieties, but those pretty much succumbed to disease and insects, and that's when he turned his attention to domestic vines. And he eventually, next slide, please. Yep, he eventually had 10 acres of land and approximately 22 varieties of vines under cultivation at the vineyard. And he regularly advertised, you can see the advertisement on the left, for both the fruit of the vines and the vines themselves, which he sold. And he is actually known for having developed the Catawba variety of grapes for a wine, and that was sold to a viticulturist in New York, and he developed the Catawba vineyard, which is still a grape used in winemaking today. So it traces, that Catawba vine or grape and wine traces its roots back to DC. The map, sort of the underlying map on the screen, shows the property historically in what is today North Cleveland Park, right around Springland Lane. And after Adlam's death, the property was inherited by his daughter, who built her own house there with her husband. That's called Springland, and Springland still stands today. But in addition to Springland, they built this spring house, which you see on the right, and that spring house is just lovely, and it's really embedded in this steep south-facing slope of land where those vines had been planted. So if you're ever traveling down Reno Road and turn onto Springland Lane, go up, take a look at this spring house. You can see it from the street, and just imagine the hillside behind it covered with the vineyard and the grapevines that John Adlam planted there. And it is a very provocative the vision, seeing that spring house and thinking about rural Washington that way. Just seeing these hills to see, think about how they were used in the past. Next slide, please. So as the city grew in the first half of the 19th century, you can see from this map, which is a map from it was surveyed in 1856 and 57 and 58, but made in 1859 by this map maker named Albert Boschke. And I love this map because you can see how what had formerly in the 18th century been all rural lands was now a city in the center, the city of Washington. You can see the L'Enfant Plan and all the houses and buildings, commercial government buildings being built. And yet outside of the L'Enfant Plan, it is still a rural landscape. And the landscape had changed, obviously. It was no longer large, extensive tobacco plantations from the 18th century, but they had been reduced significantly in size through through land sales and inheritance. And so rather than the sort of average farm size of over 100 acres, the farms were small, sometimes 10 acres, sometimes even smaller, but the median farm size was about 40 acres. You can see, looking at this map, the real differentiation, obviously, between the city and the countryside. But then also, if you look closely, you can see all of those. I mean, you can't see the names, but you can see where names are on the map. And those represent the different rural properties. So you can see how many small farmsteads existed where there had been sort of extensive plantations. By the mid-19th century, and you can switch slides now, please. By the mid-19th century, tobacco was no longer being planted. Farmers were instead planting wheat and rye, corn, oats, potatoes. They were raising cattle and sheep for slaughter, and they were raising market crops for sale at local markets to feed the growing population of the city. Pierce Mill survives today as the best example of a mid-19th century farm complex. The Pierce family raised hay, they had other grains, they had fruit trees by the thousands, they ran a nursery, they had a sawmill, and of course they operated the flour mill, which we all know and love today. This was one of many dozen mills along Rock Creek, by the way. There were many mills all along Rock Creek that produced flour for sale at City Market and for home consumption as well. And most farms, like this, would have also had a milk cow and hogs and chickens for their own consumption. Next slide, please. This farmhouse, which is still standing on Foxhall Road, was built in 1865, and it was at the center of an all-important butchering industry in DC. And this photograph, I think, is just amazing. The historic photograph on the lower right shows the house. If you can see, in the center of that historic image is the house that you see up in the left, the Shealy Brown farmhouse. The photographer who took this photograph, William Morris Smith, actually photographed this house under construction. If you look closely, you can see that the roof is unsheathed. And it's just a remarkable photo, especially given that the house still survives. So this house was built in before the end of the Civil War, and it was in the heights of what we call the heights of Georgetown, up above Georgetown. And it was near a cattle depot. Next slide, please. Not sure if I show the cattle depot here or not. Yep, I do. Okay. And so there was a huge, obviously, meat cattle industry in Virginia. Washington didn't really have extensive enough farms to have so many cattle, but the farmers drove their cattle across the river, and then they brought them to this cattle yard right along today's Reservoir Road. You can see I've circled it in the lower left. It says cattle yard. And the cattle were then left there to be fattened up after having been driven across many miles to get there. They were fattened up, and then they would have been bought by butchers like the Shealy family. You can see in the upper right, I've circled the Augustus Shealy house. He was a farmer. He would go down to the cattle yard, buy the cattle, bring them back to his farm where he would then slaughter them. and then would take them to the local city markets for sale at market. And you can see the right side where Georgetown is. I've circled the Georgetown market there. So the Sheelys had market stalls actually at Georgetown Market, at Center Market, and I think Riggs Market up in DuPont Circle. But just wanted to show this map to sort of show you the proximity of all of these farm-related manufacturing and sales sites. The photograph on the right is not a member of the Sheely family, but the Sheelys sold their property to the Brown family that continued in the butchering industry. The slaughterhouse was on the Sheely property. They just bought it and continued slaughtering animals. This photograph is from 1949. It shows this guy, the butcher, Milton Brown, with his knife in hand. And I guess that's a cow. It doesn't look like today's cows to me, but it is a cow. So next slide, please. So the district's, lifestyle, rural landscape and lifestyle was really rudely interrupted by the Civil War. Up until the Civil War, rural Washington, it's sort of known as the quiet years. It's like the farmers were doing well. They were producing food for the growing population of the city. They had their own, vegetable gardens for themselves. It was a time of quietude in the countryside. The Civil War totally altered that existence. The federal government, obviously, Union Army, came in and built a whole series of forts surrounding the city. And you can see those in blue. They formed a ring around the city. And they built the forts. You can see the next slide is one of the forts, which is Fort Stevens. Next slide. And in doing so, they not only built the forts, but they basically felled all the timber, destroyed the orchards, destroyed all the cultivated fields, removed many of the farm buildings, and they built military roads between all of the forts. All of this was to improve lines of sight between the forts and to see, the potential enemies coming into the city. So the farmers were really ruined, and Constance Green, or Margaret Leach, sorry, not Constance Green, Margaret Leach, who is a historian of early Washington, wrote about that in her book and says the farmers were ruined. Not only were their orchards and vegetable gardens trampled and their fields filled with tents, but the very face of the land was changed and its soil was shifted into high mounds and deep ditches. Next slide. And the farmers whose land was seized were given no choice in the matter. It was eminent domain due to war needs, and it didn't matter where they stood on the social ladder or their wealth, their positions of power, or anything. So they equally took country estates and gentleman farms like this one, which is called Bel Air and was owned by the Brooks family, Colonel Jehiel Brooks. And in this case, you can see they built their fort on the height of the Brooks family farm up on the top. It's sort of in the center of the map there. And then just to the lower left of the fort, you can see Colonel Brooks' property, which is included the house which stands today, this great Greek Revival style house. The property included cultivated land, many orchards, and a formal garden, which was pretty unusual actually. But he was definitely saw himself as a gentleman farmer and wanted to look the part. Next slide. But other landowners were not as lucky. Oh, I meant to say that Brooks's house survived the war. It was used for headquarters by the Army, but it survived the war, and he was given the house back after the war. But other landowners were not so lucky. The military seizure of land took an especially heavy toll on the area's poorest residents. And this is an example of probably one of the saddest stories, when the Army seized the 11-acre property of a free Black farmer named Elizabeth Thomas for construction of Fort Stevens. They tore down her house along with a stable and barn. They destroyed an apple and a peach orchard, and they cut down valuable fencing. After the war, she spent several decades fighting for just compensation for her land and the loss that she incurred during 5 years of occupation. And it wasn't until 1916, more than 50 years after the end of the war, and 1 year before her death, that Congress awarded her $1,835. Just a very sad story, and yet, one of incredible, just admiration too. She survived. She moved into an area around Military Road and Georgia Avenue today that was a Black community. She managed to wait out the war, and then she did move back to her property after the war, but she had to entirely rebuild it. Next slide. And many farmhouses were destroyed too, as convalescing soldiers lit open fires inside. They were freezing cold. They were trying to stay warm, and they would light fires inside and would catch these houses on fire. And so they were demolished. But then they were also destroyed by the Union Army, including after the city's only Civil War battle at Fort Stevens. Confederate soldiers looted the land, and then as they retreated, as the Union soldiers were pushing them back out, Union soldiers were afraid the Confederates might return, and so they burnt down residences along the route that they thought Confederates may take into the city, because they thought it would provide shelter for the Confederates. So they just destroyed much of the cultural landscape of rural Washington. Next slide, please. And I see it's time is moving on, so I'm gonna speed up here. But just wanted to say that it wasn't all devastation for the farmers. Many of the farmers saw an opportunity of making money, and they sold their meats and produce and food goods to the Army. This is an example of one of those farmers, John Little, and his house was on Kalorama Park, which is right by Columbia Roads, between Columbia Road and 19th Street and Metwood Place. It's like, I don't know if you all know it, but it's in the Kalorama Triangle neighborhood. That house, the Little farmhouse, stood right in the middle of that park today. And John Little was he owned enslaved persons, and he had slaves on his property. But if you pledged your oath to the Union, if you were a slaveholder, you were allowed to keep your enslaved people. So John Little saw that as an opportunity. He didn't want to lose them, and so he pledged an oath to the Union, and he made money in the deal because he ended up selling a lot of his farm goods to the Union quartermaster, and he did quite well. Obviously, you can see he improved his house on the site. Next slide, please. Then the final phase of change, obviously, was suburbanization. And I'm showing this map because you can start to see how the suburbs are starting to encroach upon the rural landscape outside of the city of Washington in the 1890s. Streetcar lines were starting to be built to be extended beyond the city limits, and subdivisions were growing up on former farm properties. And what happened was the city politicians, congressmen, local politicians, the residents in general, just felt that there was disarray in the countryside, that these subdivisions were being built without any relationship to one another, no relationship to the city of Washington itself. And so the city ended up hiring the Olmsted firm to develop a series of maps to build out and plan the street system beyond the L'Enfant Plan. That street system is a street system that we have in place today. Next slide, please. And this is one section of that street plan. It's called the Permanent System of Highways, and it was developed in a series of sections beginning in 1897. It was finalized in 1907, and this is our street plan beyond the city as it exists today. It was a fairly progressive plan. They kept some of the existing roads, the curving roads that were conforming to the natural terrain, old farm roads, and in some cases, even some of the existing settlements, which you can see which I've circled at the left on the map. That's Reno City, which had developed after the Civil War. So some of the existing elements on the landscape survived, but most of the roads were pushed through without any consideration given to the cultural landscape. And so at that point, many of the houses and farm-related buildings were demolished. Next slide, please. So this is an example of one of the farmhouses that was destroyed. This is from the American University Courier, and the caption here says, this old farmhouse, after standing for more than a century, was taken down to make way for the extension of Massachusetts Avenue. So it was the extension of these streets out into suburban, into Washington, D.C. residential neighborhoods that eradicated that cultural landscape. Next slide. In some cases, these subdivisions actually included the retention of the historic houses and farmhouses. In this particular example, Oak View, which was where Cleveland Park was laid out, kept the mansion house there, and you can see the large lot that retained the house at the top of the plat, whereas all the other part of the farm was subdivided into lots for new houses. It was kept that way for a while, but then ultimately in the 20th century, it too was demolished, and that was also developed with houses. Next slide. I think coming to the end here. And also some of the developers saw an opportunity in kind of promoting this rural landscape. They were promoting the bucolic nature of these suburban subdivisions, and they included some of the farmhouses in their promotional brochures. And here at left, for instance, this is in a promotional brochure for American University Park showing the old mansion house, the old farmhouse. Well, that old farmhouse survives today. It was moved so that it would face 48th Street after 48th Street was laid, but you can see a picture of it in the lower right. And then a couple more slides, I think one more after this. Yeah, this is just an example of one I just wanted to show. This is a surviving farmhouse, which I love because it sits kitty corner to the street. So it's one of the ways that I was able to identify historic farmhouses because they're not aligned with the street. And you can see that both in plan on the map on the right, where you see the footprint, the pink footprint that's all askew to the lot. And then the house itself, which it's got like the edge of the side of the house facing the street, whereas the front of the house faced south. So then I just have the last slide, which shows one of the last surviving farms in the city. This is the Rupert Farm. And I just like this slide because you can see this is the Petworth subdivision south of the farm. And you can just sort of see the encroaching development moving up to this farm that's one of the last surviving ones in the area. So that is the conclusion of my presentation, and happy to take any questions if anybody has any. I know it's went on a little longer than I thought it would. Sorry about that.
Thank you very much. Very interesting to see how, what was driving the changes in the landscape, as well as, how we got to what we look at now. It's just, very fascinating. Thank you. I love the corner, your conversation about how houses just kind of got put down and the road sometimes had to go around them. That's really interesting. Cece, in the chat, Cece has commented that she believes cattle were driven from Virginia to DC on Chain Bridge.
Yes, yeah, that's true. They would have crossed the river at Chain Bridge and then come down Canal Road, or probably Canal Road, to where Canal Road and Reservoir Road intersect today, which is where the cattle yard was there. There were other cattle yards in the city. There was a cattle yard up near Brookland that was so the cattle were taken by rail to the cattle yard at Brookland and then slaughtered and taken to market from there.
Claudia has commented that experimental farming continued into the suburbs, specifically Montgomery County, Maryland, during World War II.
Okay. Claudia, what was being experimented with mostly? Was it animal husbandry or was it plants or both?
I'll unmute myself. Yeah, it was animal husbandry and I think, during World War II to protect the food supply, and then that notion of gentleman farmers, there were some model dairy farms and things like that out in Montgomery County, lower Montgomery County. And of course, that eventually the suburbanization just wiped that out.
Yeah. The last farm in DC was actually a dairy farm that was in Southeast, and it operated until 1960 something. That was the last surviving farm.
Where does the Beltsville Agricultural Research Center fit into any of this? Claudia, was that part of the Montgomery County piece? It's not in Montgomery County, but
No, I don't know about that. I think it probably has to do with University of Maryland being a land grant university.
probably, yeah. Okay, thank you. And Audrey just commented, the subject doesn't have to be just culinary history. This was an interesting presentation. Laurie Bell also says fascinating presentation and historical information. Laurie commented with that as well. Super interesting, thank you. She also says before the Civil War, were most of the agricultural products consumed locally, much of it exported to outside the region?
Yeah, so there was a big wheat producing, we produced a lot of wheat that was exported, and that was exported to England, actually. But that kind of ceased as the city grew up, and most of the farms by the mid-19th century were really just for local consumption. We did not export beyond the city. It was all of the crops being raised were really for the market. So vegetables and, meat butchering obviously was big. But yeah, wheat production and up until even the early 19th century was pretty big. I think there was a shortage of wheat and in England, and so we produced a lot of wheat here to send over.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. The Burroughs house that you mentioned early in the presentation that was moved, do the current owners, do you think they know the history of that house, that it had been on its side and then righted and so forth?
Yeah, they know. I mean, I don't know about the current owners, but that house was designated as a historic landmark a number of years ago now, and they were involved in the designation. And so, yeah, they were very aware of it. And the house also has had an addition put on, and it's been renovated and stabilized, but the interiors are very intact. So, it is, but also wooden buildings are pretty malleable. So like you can move a wooden frame building pretty easily. You just, lift it up and it's done still. I mean, it's expensive, but in the 19th century, it was less expensive in some ways to move a building than it was to build a new building because the materials were hard to come by. Materials were very valuable. These houses had wood and glass in the windows. All of these things were very expensive. And so it made sense if, to move houses. And that's why there was this little bit of a struggle for me sometimes to identify where all the old houses were because they didn't show up on maps because they'd already been moved. And many of the houses that are older that weren't sitting after the streets were cut and laid and they were sitting askew. Many of the property owners then just moved them to face the street. Like they weren't even moved 45 degrees, but they were moved to be straight and in line with the street. So,
it's just hard to think about it being put on its side and righted.
Yeah, I know that is kind of crazy.
Integrity to make that happen. I don't think that would happen within our current building techniques.
No, I mean that is kind of crazy to think about, but yeah, and the article, who knows? The article was written in 1923, but it was said pretty clearly the house was sitting on its side waiting to be righted. So I can't imagine they were making that up, but
Any other comments? Well, Kim, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and just this really fascinating, as everybody said, historical look into, you know, the changes in the DC area over the years, what prompted them, and you know how things had to be moved around and fixed, and the way the land grants. I mean, George Washington was, yeah, that was just such a really interesting idea about how to get people to agree to, you know, give land to the federal government that they needed, and you know, try
Yeah.
not to, you know, take too much away from, you know, what they had as well because of its value for the land. So all in all, it's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that is really fascinating part of our history, is just how the federal city came to be. And it was a very creative idea of George Washington's, and it worked for the most part. So
I had never really thought about how the Civil War might have affected the farm community here inside the district. I just didn't know that history at all. So that was very
yeah,
interesting to me. I
found it.
grew up in the Revolutionary era in
Okay.
New York State, so knew all about the Revolutionary War, but less about the effect on the Civil War here.
Yeah, it's interesting because in writing the book, I definitely read some memoirs of some of the young Union officers who kept journals and things, and and many of them were very saddened by what they were doing, because many of them came from rural America. I mean, they were farmers, they were children of farmers, and it pained them to cut down these beautiful orchards, you know, these peach trees and apple trees and everything, but you know, they were doing it in the name of war, but you know, it was definitely hard. So that was kind of interesting to get a perspective from the soldiers.
It makes me wonder, if there had been no Civil War, for example, what might the
Left.
city have looked like?
Yeah. I mean, suburbanization was bound to happen anyway, but the Civil War definitely, I think, it accelerated it, because for many reasons, you know, sometimes the land that was taken, then after the war, the original owners had died or they found new jobs, you know, they were no longer farming, and so that land was not recultivated after the war, and it became ripe for development. So the Civil War, yeah, did also, you know, accelerate the development of the outside. And then obviously there was great growth in the population, and an increase in population needed more housing, and you know, everything. So it would have happened eventually, but it was a big changing point.
We're going to move to the business part of our meeting. Kim, if you want to hang around, that's fine. If not, again, thank you so much for, you know, spending your time and sharing your expertise around this issue.
Sure, thanks.
And just to remind you, you do get a 1-year free membership.
Oh, okay.
Now, as a result of doing the presentation. So we hope to see you at future meetings. That would be wonderful.
Great. Be sure to include me on your email so I know when the meetings are.
Absolutely.
Thank you, and sorry for the late start with the technical difficulties, and thank you, Caroline, for helping out here. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay. Well, thank you all. You're right. It doesn't have to be food to be historical. And the tie-in with the farms is really interesting to me. I'd like to welcome our newest member to CHoW, Dr. Lisa Beth Furstenberg. Welcome. I'm glad you came to the meeting today. And we just want to let you know how thrilled you are that you've just already stepped up to volunteer to take on some tasks. That's something we really appreciate. The organization is a small organization, so helping hands are, you know, always welcome. And, you know, we're excited that you've done that already. I understand we'll be looking forward to a book review in a future CHoW line, and that you've agreed to report on our April meeting.
Right.
So thank you so much.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Does anybody have any whatsits today? No. Maybe we ought to have a conversation about whether we continue the what's it part of the meeting.
It doesn't seem to have translated very well into a virtual environment.
Yeah,
you know, it's different when we could pass it around, but
right.
We could try to concentrate maybe and bring what's-its to our June luncheon, that in-person luncheon. Maybe we should think about encouraging people to do that and have a what's-it bonanza or something.
That could be cute.
Yeah.
What's the prize?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't want to sound like Desi Arnaz, but explain it to me, Lucy. What's it?
Well, that is the question, exactly. People would bring interesting objects that were related to culinary practices, shall we say, and pass it around, and we'd have to guess what it was for. What is it? That's a what's it.
Mhm. Are there any culinary meetings, information coming up that anybody wants to share with the group?
Well, our next meeting, of course.
Right. Now, I know in the January, December, January CHoW line, there was, for the first time that I remember seeing, CC and included some upcoming programs by the culinary historians of New York, which I believe we would have access to. So, you know, thank you, CC, for starting to include that. Our next meeting is about the picky American children. I think that's going to be very interesting to a lot of us. Helen Zoe Veit has written a book called Picky: How American Children Became the Pickiest Humans in History. Comes from Michigan State University, and that is on February 9th. So hope to see everybody here. And any comments, anything anybody wants to add, questions about anything? Nope. Well, stay safe in the snow if we get any more. I'm hoping that we're done for the year personally, but we'll see. All right, bye-bye. See everybody in February.
Thank you.